thank you very much for being here. We are delighted to welcome you all to the Center for International Higher Education. I am Gerardo Blanco, and I serve as the Academic Director of CIHE, and we have very many special guests with us. It's very exciting to see such a full auditorium, and we understand this is prime time for travel. Many folks are on vacation, out of town, and it's so wonderful to be in this space with all of you. We want to welcome very many special colleagues, friends, but two particular groups really stand out. We want to welcome our colleagues who just have wrapped up the official activities of our West CIHE Summer Institute, and we are really honored to have with us colleagues from West who have joined us. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you to all of the 70 participants from over 30 different countries who have been part of the Summer Institute. So welcome and thank you for being here. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention all of the different mentors that have come from universities from around the world to support this effort of fostering the next generation of scholars within the field. And it's quite appropriate, of course, to culminate these activities with the second Altbach lecture. I also want to greet our students in the incoming cohort of the Executive EDD in Higher Education here at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, who also have come from far and wide around the world and across the United States. So it's so wonderful that you're here with us. I just have two reminders. We are recording this session, so of course this will be available for those of our colleagues who are not able to join us here, and of course for all of us, so that we can preserve the insights and memories of this very important moment together. And also, if you are like me, I'm constantly scavenging videos to use on my Canvas sites and different instructional materials. Also, so the recording will be available within the next few weeks. And also I wanted to say, if you want to continue learning more about the Center for International Higher Education, the history, and the very extensive contributions that Phil Altbach has made to the field, you need only to look for Letter to the Field. You can find the link on the CIHE website, on any of your preferred search engine, and now, of course, any AI chatbot as well. But it contains a series of conversations that really document the development and the evolution, not only of CIHE, but also to the center. And of course, the many contributions that Phil has made to the field. So now to the matter at hand. Phil is looking at me like I'm already going for too long. So last year, in 2023, as part of the first CIHE biennial conference, we started the very first Philip G. Altbach lecture. And this is intended, the purpose of this lecture was not only to celebrate Phil's contributions to CIHE, but more broadly to the entire field of international higher education. And of course, in particular, we wanted to punctuate a couple of things. First of all, his unwavering dedication to fostering networks, but also to forging connections across borders and disciplines, and also his extensive experience and contribution as a mentor to other researchers. So that, of course, will become self-evident as I turn it over to Rebecca to introduce our speaker for this evening. So I just wanted to remind you all of these many contributions and also to say how lucky we are not only to have all of you here, but also to have this opportunity to gather in honor of Phil's legacy to the field. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague Roberta.
morning, everybody. I think most of you know me, but I'm Rebecca Schindel. I'm the Managing Director of CIG, and I have the most pleasurable job of the evening, which is introducing our speaker this evening for the second annual Altbach lecture. So Dr. Roberta Malee Bassett is Global Lead for Tertiary Education and Senior Education Specialist at the World Bank, where she provides coordinated oversight to the World Bank's $7 billion global lending and analytical efforts supporting post-secondary education reforms around the world. She leads operational teams implementing projects across a variety of tertiary and higher education projects, addressing issues such as finance, quality assurance reform, internationalization of higher education, equity and access, research and competitiveness, and skills development. Prior to joining the bank, she held positions in both academia and higher education administration in the US and the UK. She's published numerous books and articles on international higher education and most recently co-authored the World Bank's 2021 Tertiary Education Policy Advisory Report, Steering Tertiary Education Towards Resilient Systems That Deliver for All. And amidst these myriad accomplishments, what is probably the most important and impressive fact is that she earned her PhD in International Higher Education from Boston College in 2005. Dr. Altbach himself. So with no further ado, I'd like to pass the floor to Roberta. Roberta, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Okay. Probably should keep that one if you want it.
Good evening, everybody. I'm really astonished that this many people actually stayed behind to listen to me speak. So thank you all for your kind attention to my presence here. I want to thank Gerardo and Rebecca for the invitation. It was about 24 years ago when I was in Stanford, California, where I was an assistant dean for summer session. And I've been there for 6 years, where I started interacting with Phil. And I had long since thought about trying to find a way to make international part of my higher education experience. I am the child of an immigrant and had always wanted to have an international experience, and Phil did all the research, and so it was a no-brainer for me to make my way from the lovely, warm climates of Palo Alto, California, and come to Boston. And the only thing that made that okay was that he had left Buffalo, so Boston's better than Buffalo, right? So anyway, and my career is entirely based on the foundations I built with Phil, and so it is a real honor to be back here to honor his presence and also to thank him for all he has done for me to help me become the professional that I am. So, as has been said, I am the Global Lead for Tertiary Education at the World Bank. I suspect many of you do not know that the World Bank does tertiary education, and so it's a pleasure to introduce our work to you, explain a little bit about the bank. My presentation today is in 3 parts that are kind of woven together. I will talk a bit about a new global report that we're about to launch in the autumn. We've done a lot of the data collection, so you will be the first to see many of the tables that we have developed, and they're very nascent. But so I will talk through what we're finding, but we haven't done the writing yet, so really it's very preliminary, and we will roll it out next year, so maybe when you're in your real jobs, you'll see this come out in your country, because we'll do it globally. That's the new study. We have a study, as Rebecca said, on the Steering Tertiary Education Framework. I will weave what we're doing into the framework so that you can see why we developed this framework. And then the third part is I will tell you what we do at the World Bank for Tertiary Education. So it's in 3 parts. Hopefully by the end, I won't have talked too long and you will actually have a clearer sense of what the World Bank does in tertiary education. So I named this presentation, Making the Case for Tertiary Education. You may or may not understand the policy frameworks around investments in tertiary education globally, but it is one of the hardest sectors to get governments or international financing agents to contribute to, largely because you see the learning poverty crisis that's happening in primary education. It feels more resonant to go in and fix what's happening with primary school students, which I completely understand. But we need to establish the evidence base for why it still matters to invest in tertiary education, which is what we are doing with this report. So first I'll just talk a little bit about what we mean when we talk about tertiary education and why we at the World Bank are constantly pressing on why it's important to invest. And so for us, we look at all forms of formal post-secondary education, not just universities. For many of you, you may think about higher education solely, which is the university environment. We look at anything that provides a formal certification degree in any form, polytechnics, post-secondary TVET, etc. And why do we do it? So this is the sound bites that we keep trying to build and reform or revise at the bank so that when we go into a Ministry of Finance or we go into a Ministry of Education, we can say this is why it matters. We know it because it fosters long-term growth, much more than other sectors, and I will show you some evidence on that because we've been doing this work. Workers with tertiary education are more employable, they earn higher wages, and they cope better with economic shocks. And you may have seen during COVID, there was a little bit of a blip in parts of the world about the enrollment and the employment of post-secondary ed graduates, but that corrected much faster than any of the other sectors. And so people with post-secondary education are still better off when there's times of economic crisis. And you'll see in my conversation today too, I won't speak very much about social development, I'll speak very strongly about economic development. We can talk during the Q&A about why, but that economic development is the more powerful argument to get policymakers to pay attention. So that's the short answer to why that is. The highest return on investment, and how many here actually have studied the World Bank in any form before? Okay, so you're probably familiar with the rate of return research that George Sakharopoulos and Harry Petrinos does. That was an argument that for a couple of decades seemed to supply the evidence that you should invest in primary. Around the late 90s, the evidence actually started shifting, and so there's really some very robust evidence that shows that tertiary education has the strongest return on investment, particularly in low-income countries, which is the climate we care the most about. And then the last one is the social stuff, which we all care about very much, but policymakers don't, which is that the people with tertiary education vote more, they live healthier lives, they have happier marriages, their children do better in school. Like there's a ton of research around these secondary peripheral benefits. We know they matter. Depends on what country you live in, if they care. So these are actually new numbers. We've had this slide evolving from different data sources. So this is one of the new ones that we've calculated. And there's a bit of a mixed, I think, perception on how fast the sector is growing and what the enrollment levels are now. But anyway, you can see there's been a quite steady growth. In the last 25 years, enrollments globally doubled between 2000 and 2013, so it's been quite an exponential growth in every region. What you see though, which I think maybe you can see that on another slide, it's tracking with secondary growth as well. So we follow the pipeline of the education expansion. A lot of work went into primary education. You'll see on another slide. The growth in primary has been then pushing the pipeline down, and there are pressures on tertiary which are actually helping us in our work. Here's the tertiary education attainment pattern. So this is not enrollment patterns. You don't actually have to take pictures. I'll give you the power. I mean, you can, but I'll give you the power. So, I think it's a way that I do not have to look at the speaker, which I actually really do appreciate. But I will also give you the slides, so don't worry. And so here you can see there's a projection up towards 2050 on what the pattern of growth is going to look like for tertiary education. And we are mapping that over growth patterns since the 70s, but also what we've seen in the last sort of 40 years. We're really seeing the exponential growth, and we're mapping it to secondary education completion, right? So there's a lot of expectations of growth. There is parts of the world like Africa and South Asia where the youth population is going to be the massive amount of youth on the planet by 2050. And you're going to see this exponential improvements on attainment of tertiary education by then. But here's where we, from a policy perspective, are trying to intervene to show that there are serious gaps in access based on income quintiles, right? So the socioeconomic diversification of the sector has to then include those from the lowest income and the highest income groups. Here you can see by parental education. This is the research that we're conducting right now. Parents with primary, parents with secondary, parents with tertiary education, and who attends tertiary education. Right? So where do their children end up going to school? The vast majority of those who end up in tertiary education are coming from families where there is tertiary education somewhere already in all of the regions. But this is where we need to put a lot more effort to recognize that the equity gaps that exist in accessing tertiary education are built very strongly on family foundations, and how can policy intervene to overcome some of those built-in social structures and barriers to access. This is just to explain why we are, it's another argument for why it's important to invest in tertiary education. The World Economic Forum has listed the most important skills for jobs in the future. And you can see most of them are post-secondary education skills. The skills for manufacturing, the skills for agriculture, those skills are falling off in almost every region where we're working. And these are the cognitive, self-efficiency management skills that tertiary education provides. But very often, you probably see it in your home countries, we see it with our policymakers, that there's an emerging conversation that post-secondary education is not worth it. It's not technical enough, they're not building job-related skills, and then the job-related skills become very explicit to one industry or one employer, and then it's everyone's here job, it's my job to explain why you actually have to have a mobile workforce, and these transversal skills are the skills of the future, and they've been mapped out in a very specific understanding of what the economies of the world will need. So that's sort of all the macro background. I'll talk a bit about the bank now. This one actually is very data rich. So we have right now, as Rebecca had already said, about $7.9 billion in active lending in post-secondary education around the world. Since 2015, just about 300 projects. We have right now 70 active projects. And they range in value. I lead a $500 million project in Tanzania. We have projects, I led one in Montenegro that was $12 million. So you can see there's a wide array of structures for our lending programs, largely driven by the countries themselves. So what can they afford to borrow? What are they trying to accomplish? What questions are they trying to answer? And can they utilize the World Bank's financing or technical expertise to answer those questions in a sustainable way? That's how we largely approach these types of program development. So Africa has the most projects, and followed by Europe and Central Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And here you can see too. There was a shift, I think just this year, we have a $1.5 billion project that was just approved for India. So India, when I change my slides, is going to have one of the highest ones. So here's the most recent data and the distributions across that should total up to 7.9 billion. If they don't, someone in Washington made a mistake. But you can see here that Africa is by far the largest recipient of our tertiary education, and that actually is true for all segments of our education portfolio. The eyes of the bank and the world are on Africa right now. Africa is also the continent that has the weakest performance in higher education globally, and so it makes sense that we're spending all this time here. Scholars from Africa here? Yes. Africa. Okay, so I will ask you to chime in, but we know, so gross enrollment patterns in Africa are wide and terrible, right? The numbers are terrible, so there's a lot of work to be done there. So I'll be looking to be part of the solution to that as well. Why do our clients borrow for tertiary education? I should explain who our clients are. So most of the countries of the world are members of the World Bank. They either are donor countries or they're borrower countries. And occasionally they graduate from one to the other, the most illustrious example being South Korea. South Korea was a borrower for a long, long time, and now they are a donor to the World Bank. Those countries that borrow can choose what they borrow for. Very few had borrowed for higher education. Now almost every country we have education wants to borrow for tertiary education, which is a real bonus for us who do this work. But why do they borrow? They borrow to close equity gaps locally within their own countries, but also globally, and that's a really important consideration as the world is moving towards knowledge-driven work and the knowledge economy is taking over. There is, as you see locally, this expanded income inequality. You see it globally, right? One of the things you may not have been able to see on the earlier slide is that higher education enrollments, tertiary education enrollments in Africa have doubled every 20 years for the past 60 years. And the gross enrollment rate for Africa is 9%. Higher education in the rest of the world, here in the United States, 90%, 75 to 90, depending on who's doing the math. In other parts of the world, the average is something along with 50%. Africa is still sitting at this exponential growth, doubling and doubling and doubling. The gap is getting wider and wider. Right? So something dynamic has to happen to close this equity gap, not just within a single country, but across the countries. And as we're seeing, there's a disruption globally with what's happening with income inequality and all of the tensions and problems the world is facing because of this. Jobs is probably the biggest issue, more and better quality jobs, to develop local capacity to address global challenges, big ones being climate change, the implementation of AI, demographic shifts, etc. I'm happy to actually go deeper in any one of these issues, but not now. I mean, if you want to, right? If there's too much to talk about. So if you ask questions, I can talk a little bit more about all of these things. This next one is a really big issue, and again, I work mostly leading projects in Africa right now, so it's where my heart and my mind is a lot of the time, but the African Union Commission just put this new study out of their Strategy 2063, which has really made a pillar of African Union development, higher education. One of the big one being to improve the quality of teaching and research to the development of PhDs, right? So there's a huge push to have better teaching in the universities, better teaching in all institutions, better leadership in the government, better policymakers around these issues, which does require improving the quality of teaching in higher education. And then the last one, just financing, which is probably what you talk about most of the time. There's not enough money coming from governments to go into the sector, and then what will they do to find private sources or to otherwise diversify how they finance higher education, tertiary education, in order to have more efficiency in the sector. So, are there any questions so far? Okay. Here's what I said before. This one actually is where, I love this research. I hope you do too, but this is actually where you can see the push from secondary education into tertiary education and how it's happening everywhere. So the pink colored ones that are all on the left are tertiary education growth patterns up through 2050, and the right is secondary. And this is where it's most powerful, is that you can see in most of the regions of the world, we're hitting secondary education enrollments closing in on 100%. Right? This is massive shift. We have really underplayed the importance of secondary education. Secondary has largely grown simply because of the push from primary without the same kind of attention. If anyone here really cared about secondary, this bridging from secondary to tertiary is going to be a big issue coming up because there are huge gaps in preparation from secondary to tertiary. But you can see the pressures coming anyway, whether they're ready for it or not. And so we are now using this data to say the world needs to be prepared for tertiary education because it's coming. And what do you do with these secondary school graduates if you don't have good higher education for them? There's this sub-argument, which many of you may have heard, which is that there are too many people graduating with tertiary education, right? Too many people. My question always is, well, what would you do? Who would decide? Who would decide who gets to keep going? Who gets to make that decision for the poor kid or the rich kid or whatever? Who makes that decision? What is with the agency of the student in that conversation around who gets to access tertiary education? And is an unemployed graduate really the problem? It's probably not. The unemployed graduate is symptomatic of a system that's broken, but it's not necessarily the graduate's fault, right? So anyway, this is really just mapping the pressure that's coming down by 2050. Policymakers have to have places set so that they are ready for this crunch that's coming. And then here's not just the growth pattern, but the social mobility pattern. On the left-hand side, again, this idea of the projected attainment rate for tertiary and secondary, how it is growing across the region. But on the right-hand side, you can see the share of tertiary education individuals from the bottom quintile, from the lowest 20% of the economic, social, and economic status. And you can see that it's thankfully growing in much of the world, that it's becoming more equitable, but it's becoming equitable at a much slower pace than the expansion is happening, if that makes sense. So we do focus a lot on social mobility and on the experience of external non-included populations. Governments don't necessarily, so it really, again, if you're into education policy, this is a really interesting data point because we can then map this to the return on investment and say there's actually a benefit economically to having better social mobility. All of this turns into one big picture on how you advise government using solid empirical data. So here is we are structuring our global report around 3 key contributions of tertiary education to the economic growth of low and middle income countries. And because of our client context, we focused entirely on our clients and not on the US or Canada or Europe. Eastern Europe, yes. Central Asia, yes, but not on the EU, for instance. So we focused our research as showing us 3 key intervention areas that tertiary education really provides a sustained economic growth for our client countries. The labor market returns by skill development, research and development and the innovation agenda, and then the spillover effects of institutions within regions and also within families and communities. So here, I'll get into the rate of returns. I'm doing it very superficially. I teach whole classes on this, but hopefully it's enough to stimulate you to ask some questions. This is where you can see the patterns of return on investment to tertiary and secondary, the growth pattern and the returns, yes, since 1991. And you can see, even as the growth, so the green line is enrollment growth globally, the return on investment has remained largely stable. And one would expect with supply and demand alone, you would see a decrease in the return on investment to tertiary education. We aren't. We're seeing a very marginal shift, and in many places like Africa, like South Asia, even with the expanded access, the return on investment has continued to grow. There's lots of reasons for this. You probably could think of them on your own. Most of it is because the economies are evolving to need more skilled workers, so the return stays because they still don't have enough. They still have not maxed out the number of people they need in these high-skilled jobs. And for every year of tertiary education, there's a 14% increase in salary over time. Secondary education is significantly lower, and so you see that the highest returns are for tertiary education. There was a really good paper that just came out on education financing that Harry Petrinos recently published that explains this as well. So here, skills and returns. This is just a really pretty mapping of where tertiary education workers and their returns based on their location. You can see in South Asia, there's a large number, massive expansion of tertiary education workers. The returns, as you can see in the map, globally, no matter what color you're seeing there, it's still pretty constant, right? The highest returns are to those in the poorest places because they're still not maxing out their place in the economy. But regardless, there are very few outliers, and that's sort of the interesting thing about this data. It's a very consistent data set globally, showing the returns on education are very high for tertiary education. This is easier to follow. And so you can see low income, lower middle income, upper middle, and high income countries. In each of them, the returns to tertiary education is significantly higher than secondary. So what you do see, which we didn't bother because we're looking at pipeline pressures, the returns to primary are higher than secondary as well. So the map at the end of it would look like this. We don't worry so much about that because we're interested in transition from secondary to tertiary. And then this provides a little bit of a sense of heterogeneity. It's not universal. And you can see the mapping here more clearly, I hope, that by region, it's a little bit stronger. And as the regions become more economically developed, it does level off. It doesn't dip, right? You expect to see a dip, but you can see how it's different by region based on their own economic development. I know this is very data rich. Nobody has any questions? You're good? Okay. You've been sitting all day, it might help you. Anyways, well, moving on to research and innovation. And this is actually a major issue for us because countries want to become part of the knowledge economy, but also everybody wants a Silicon Valley, everybody wants Harvard. I blame Phil and Jamil Sami, everybody wants a world-class research university, right? These excellence initiatives, and we support that too, I don't really blame you for that. But the question is, how do you do research well? How do you spend the money well, and for what purpose? And that's a really big sort of compendium of issues that we focus on as we support research in our own client context. But as you can see, the wealthy countries are in gray. What we really highlighted here are China and India and how much attention has been spent in those two contexts since 2000 on improving their publications and their research outputs for their own innovation agendas. And as you also see in the same time period, massive economic growth in both of these countries, largely driven by knowledge economy investments, right? Knowledge economy expansion in their economies. And so we use this again to really have a conversation with our client countries to say, how did they do it? Why did they do it? And how is it going to have a sustained impact for their countries? Where I work, in some of the poorest countries in the world, what research is most valuable to them? It's not going to be blue skies research. It's not going to be trying to cure cancer necessarily. But it is, as you may have known, during COVID, it was about solving local problems around COVID spread, around Ebola, around answering questions that are very centered to their country, that the West is not considering or caring that much about, or that others, I mean, it's a very local thing as well. There are local communities that aren't part of the research. Globally, it's the same. Nobody's looking at Africa for Africa. Nobody's looking at South Asia. For South Asia, they look at applying global frameworks to solve local problems. And what we're really trying to encourage is using local frameworks to solve local problems and trying to learn from the global research in order to do that. Another example of tech adoption. This is really just an examination of how much are people really embracing technology that then allows them to have tech-driven jobs or access to the global tech world, right? And that is using a smartphone, doing all of your business online, paying for the bus with your phone. Like, there's a whole digital world out there that parts of the world are accelerating extremely rapidly. You can go to any place in East Asia and use your phone to pretty much do anything. And in other parts of the world where you can't do anything, or the people don't know how to do it, but if we teach them how to use some of these things, there's exponential growth in their economic capacity. So here you can see their frequency of internet usage by education level. I mean, tertiary education takes it everywhere. And then you see also on the side computer ownership. During COVID, this was a major problem for our client countries because internet penetration is terrible in much of the world. Parts of the countries where we work would be 20, 30% internet penetration. If you weren't in a city, you could not continue your studies. And that went on for years and years, right? COVID lasted well over the time it lasted where I live in Switzerland or even parts of Europe. I think it lasted a really long time here. People out of school for a lot longer here, I think. Anyway, in Africa, they were out of school. Some places were still out of school in the autumn this year, so they were out for 4 years. And that was with no learning. That is what we're tracking now as well with this learning loss through COVID. And what is it going to do for tertiary education? What will it mean to your institutions when you get these students who are 4 years behind? How do you accelerate their learning, or do you? How much of that generation is lost? It's a big issue for us in many of our client countries. This is the last really boring data, I promise, slide, but it's really interesting to me. Anyways, this growth in universities per million people. You know, Alma and I were just talking about what's happening in Mexico. Mexico opened 200 universities last year. India, on average, was opening 1,000 institutions a day, post-secondary institutions a day for many, many years. The growth in this sector is amazing. And then that actually does lead to spillover effects, not just in the number of educated people coming out, but the jobs that are created by these institutions, the amount of money that goes into housing and into the local economy as well. So here we mapped it to GDP growth. And this for us will ultimately end up being the most important slide. When we go to a country, we will say, you can see with the growth of universities, with the growth of post-secondary education, your GDP growth is happening and is a sustained growth. So yeah, it's very exciting to me. So, and then last, and this might actually be really interesting to many of you here, here you can see labor force participation. This is a very difficult thing to map. So again, if you're a quant person, you're going to totally love that this was something you could do. If you're qualitative, it's not particularly, unless you like the story, which I do. So we actually looked at labor force participation globally, and we broke it down by education level and then also by gender. And what you can see most powerfully is how tertiary education impacts the lives of women globally. In this entire study, women with tertiary education have, in many regions and in many income quintiles, double, triple the enrollment rates that they would have at a lower level of exit from their education pipeline. Labor force participation is also quite indicative of the role of mothers and women in society, their levels of autonomy. So we can extrapolate from labor force participation that can be measured. So it's not gray market participation, it is real salaried work type of participation. The high impact. It impacts everybody. You see it's better for everybody, labor force participation, but it especially affects women. Now we saw in a place like India that labor force participation actually leveled off, even with improved access, which has led to a lot of questions internally. I would love to hear any thoughts you may have on this. One of the ideas that was being floated around is that for social mobility, improved marriages was enough for a lot of the women in a very conservative society to then have a return, but we can't map that return to a labor market return, which was going to require us to come up with another kind of formula to still capture that there's a benefit, that it's a social benefit, and maybe even an economic benefit. We don't know how we would define that. But the overall macro perspective from the data is that it has a massive impact on labor force participation. And this is something that also means the labor force participation is higher skilled, which means the economy is being pulled up with better jobs. Great. So I'm going to be skipping over some of this because this could go on too long. I will just give you the framework of the STEER framework, and then we can move into Q&A. I will give you the whole presentation so that you can see what the framework in its implementation looks like. But we came up with a STEER framework in 2021, during COVID, because we were actually getting asked a lot of questions by our client countries of how can they use this time well to assess the state of their tertiary education sectors. Their students were out of school, they had the capacity to really look at some data, or really ask them questions, are they doing a good job? We wanted to provide them with an instrument that they could use, just simply march through it and ask questions. Do we have this? Do we have this? Are we doing this well? So it's a very simple policy framework. We chose the STEER acronym, one, because the World Bank loves acronyms. Lots and lots of acronyms. There's books on the World Bank acronyms. But also because it's actually, all of these things are very useful in trying to remember the instrument and then defining what's happening with the instrument. So in the STEER framework, the first point is strategically diversified systems. As I said, we are really looking to move away from university-only perspectives on what happens after secondary education. And now it's all this moving into micro-credentials and staff degrees, and I have a lot of opinions about all of that, but what we're really interested in, to me, is what can you do to build skills without the full investment in the research university in too many of them. Every country needs one. As Phil said, it's like an airline. Every country wants to have a flagship institution. I think there's nothing wrong with that at all, but it's inefficient when it comes to trying to educate 90% of your population, right? So how can you diversify in a very strategic way to get the returns that you want and to give people the agency they need to get the education they want and the outcomes that they're seeking? The second point is technology. It kind of goes without saying, but before COVID, we weren't stressing technology at all. There was a real sense that there was obsolescence happening with these investments in technology. They were investing a lot of money, laptops for kids that were no great learning returns. COVID changed all of that, and now it's really about how do you access technology that's appropriate for the context where you live. And then today it's about AI, and what are we going to do about AI and whether students can learn with the AI instrument. But even that, during COVID, AI wasn't a thing. So that's all new for us as well. The third point is equity. Who gets to go? Who's funding it? Right? What do they get to study? I have whole tables on this, which you will get, but it's horizontal and vertical. Do they make it through from secondary up to as high as they wish to go? But also, are they directed to programs of study based on things that don't have to do with their interests or their capacity? So you'll see a lot of women being directed towards social fields or nursing, not towards STEM. Poor students are very often not directed at all towards engineering or business. So is it a horizontally equitable as much as a vertically equitable space? Do they get to all go to the most illustrious institutions, or poor kids are sent to technical institutions, right? There's still a lot of tension around where students get to go, even if they get to access the system at all. This fourth point, efficiency, is about both fiscal efficiency and operational efficiency. Do you have the people in place that you need? Do you have a quality assurance regime that's effective? Are you financing it well? Do you manage your talent well? Right? All of those big operational and financial decisions and management structures that allow a system to work well. And then the last point is resilience. And we're seeing much more pressures on resilience now. Climate change, political pressures, war, pick a thing, pandemics. Institutions are thinking more and more about how they manage to deliver their mission and their education in times of disruption, and how can we as the World Bank help them do that. Tertiary education policy should be more focused on lifting the bottom instead of pulling at the top. And so this is where we are at the World Bank going to focus our discussion with our policymakers. And what I didn't say before is most tension we get around questions about post-secondary education actually come from World Bank people. When I have to go to the country director of Angola and say, I really think you need to be investing in tertiary education, he's going to say, well, we have roads that need to be built, and we have tax policy that we need to reform, and we need to improve their defense spending, and all of these other things. And he's right? That's true. And so I have to be able to make the case on why, yes, but you can't have good roads if you don't have good engineers, and good engineers come from better higher education, right? So this is me drilling into deep down into, but it is how we get access to these funds and how we have projects to help students. So we're focusing this on 3 issues: strengthening the labor market connections of the post-secondary education. For example, in my Tanzania project that I lead, $500 million, each of the universities, we're funding every university in Tanzania to some extent through these strategic investment plans. Every one of those plans has to have an industry advisory council attached to it. So they had to build these councils that have at least 5 to 10, depending on the size of the institution, representatives from the private sector, not to actually impact policy, but to inform and to show that there's a connection between what happens after to what happens on the campus. We do encourage tracer studies. This is very normal for American students. They're very used to having to keep track, say your university, what your email is, where you're working now. American institutions, I went to Columbia University for my first degree. They still know where I am. I still somehow get the Columbia magazines, no matter where in the world I live. But it means they still know, that they really care what happens to their alum. This is almost unheard of in most of the world, and so this is something we support a lot, because if they can understand what happens to their graduates, they can make the education better, or they can argue that what they're doing is already great. But without data, you can't say either of those things. And then again, we invite employers to teach. We are doing a lot with experiential learning, trying to get students to have more apprenticeships and internships, et cetera. And we're doing that for academic staff as well, getting academic staff to do 2 to 5 weeks within an industry to actually see if their teaching is applied in any way. It's changing a lot how they teach and who they bring into their classrooms to talk to their students. We are focusing a lot on social mobility and talent. We have a really great project in Romania that was starting with the year 11, the equivalent of the junior year in high school, and went to the second year of university and followed students throughout, providing financial support when that was articulated as the problem, also doing learning labs and really supporting academic development, because the transition and the bridging from secondary to tertiary is often ignored, as I said before, but something that can change completely the dropout rates of those who are accessing higher education. And the last point is about technology adoption and transversal skill development that does focus on digital skills. It's super dry and boring, but digital skills are everything now, and so we're really working with institutions to think about incorporating technology in all facets of what they're doing. So why else should our clients be investing in tertiary education? The first point, which I hope you got through the course of this talk, is to stem the losses. Really, it's to just stop the bleeding. What's happening right now is that knowledge and service industries are taking over the global economy, and those that are focused on agriculture still or manufacturing still are just falling out the bottom, and the improvement in skills should find ways to, we know it will help them close these gaps, or at least stop the bleeding, right? To build resilience into their societies and economies, better leaders with better education, stronger families that understand the dynamics of what's happening in the political and economic environments. All of these things will support stronger resilience in societies and economies. This last one is to sit as equals in the global community. It's very difficult for countries that are poor to sit as equals and accept what's being told to them and pushed on them globally by the countries with the power. Those with more education can actually sit and speak as equals, and that we're seeing it all over the world. It does change entirely how they can access all sorts of things: financing, diplomacy, support during times of crisis, right? So it really matters. And then the last point is to find local solutions using global knowledge and applying it as needed on the ground in the countries. I think that's probably long enough. So thank you very much.